Hey everybody, Alex here for Nerdy Inc. Coming at you with something kind of different for today. In a couple hours, Netflix is going to debut Daredevil, or depending on when you're watching this, maybe they already have. So what I wanted to do was talk about some of my favorite Daredevil comics. As the show starts to gain traction, a lot of people are going to have a renewed interest in the books, and it's going to sort of make people wonder, where do I start? What's the right book for me? So I wanted to talk about some of the different authors, some of the different takes on Daredevil, and talk about why I like them, why I think it may be good for this type of reader and not for this type of reader, and sort of give people some good recommendations. So the first one I'm going to start off with is the one that you have to mention, and that is the Frank Miller run for Daredevil. This really is the defining Daredevil work in terms of sort of creating the character as who he is today. Originally, he was sort of a low-level hero, kind of not necessarily an A-lister or even a B-lister, and he was just sort of a cheesy way to just, let's fight some bad guys. Frank Miller turned him into an anti-hero. He turned him into a very dark, sympathetic character who sort of blurs the lines between good and evil. He gave us some of the darkest, most heartfelt comics that Daredevil has ever seen. The primary ones to mention are obviously the ones that feature the face-off between Bullseye and Elektra, the confrontation between Bullseye and Daredevil, and then sort of the book that wrapped it all up, which is, in some people's mind, the best Daredevil book ever, Roulette. One of the great things about this book is that there's a lot of humor mixed in as well as sort of the emotion, so you get some great moments. One of the ones, I don't remember which issue it's in, but there's a great moment when 4 different people are all trying to find Stick, who is Daredevil's mentor, and they all sort of have a little run-in with one poor guy who knows where Stick is. I do need to warn you that some of the stuff is a little bit dated. That's because what we thought was dark in the 80s and what we think is dark now are two completely different things. So bear in mind the context in which this was written when you read it, but definitely check this out because this is sort of the defining Daredevil book. So, if Daredevil was defined by Frank Miller in the 80s, he was redefined by Brian Michael Bendis in the 2000s. I have right here all 3 copies that comprise the entire Bendis-Malieve run from the early 2000s, and this really brought Daredevil back into the 2000s and he modernized them again. There's some really compelling stories in here, a lot of bouncing back and forth between Daredevil having highs and lows, but there's some really cool stories. There's one in this first one where he defends the White Tiger in court, who was sort of a vigilante in his own right, and it's a very great book. It's very gripping, and it's weird because not a lot of procedurals, not a lot of courtroom stories have that sort of tense feeling. It's really hard to do, especially if you don't have a legal background or understand what's going on. So Bendis does an insanely good job making it interesting for the reader. The artwork is great as well. It's a little bit different than Frank Miller's. It's a little bit darker. It's a little bit grittier. Frank Miller's has sort of a cartoonish vibe at times. This brought it back to a very interesting place. If you pick up this one, the first 4 issues that are going to be in it are not sort of the main storyline of Daredevil. Instead, you get 4 issues called Wake Up, and it's told from reporter Ben Ulrich, who works for the Daily Bugle, and it's his story investigating sort of a crime that happened that Daredevil was tangentially involved in, but the facts aren't quite known, and it's a really great, really touching story. For 4 issues, it was extremely well done. So I recommend Brian Michael Bendis' run. That's my personal favorite for the character. The current story for Daredevil is being written by Mark Waid. Now, I don't want to completely gloss over Ed Brubaker. However, his story is just a darker sort of version of what Brian Michael Bendis did. I don't want to discredit it in any way because it's very good. But if you liked Bendis's, you should continue reading this one. Whereas Mark Waid gives us something new. The Mark Waid storyline is a much happier version of Daredevil, actually. And it's sort of refreshing because after 20 years of seeing this guy just get beaten and having his life just fall apart, it is sort of nice to have some fun issues again. That's not to say that there's not serious topics discussed. At one point there's an arc in which Daredevil is going after the White Serpent, which is a racist group, and you can tell when reading it how affected Mark Waid was by the Trayvon Martin killing. So it's very interesting to read how these sort of real-world events tied into the events that Mark Waid was writing. This was not in this one. This is only the first trade because he's still running, and I want to eventually get Mark Waid's as a whole. So I only have the first trade paperback of him. But it's definitely something to go for if you want something a little bit lighter, a little bit happier, but still reflective of some very serious issues. Another really good Frank Miller one that if you don't want to commit to that giant omnibus that I had is the Born Again saga. This is a story in which Kingpin goes after Daredevil because he finds out Daredevil's true identity. He finds out, oh, Matt Murdock. So this is a really interesting book Really dark, really sad, but ultimately one of the most unique stories I've ever read because it really shows sort of the triumph and the iron will that Matt Murdock has. It's only 6 books total, but it's very well written. It goes a little bit darker actually than Frank Miller's initial run, but it's still very, very good. Another great one to discuss right now is also Daredevil Yellow, which is written by Jeff Loeb. This is really interesting. A, because it's a little bit of backstory. B, it deals with an event. I don't want to spoil it for you because it happens in the main storyline, but it also might happen in the Netflix show. I'm not sure, so I don't want to tell people what happens because it might happen in the show. I don't know. I haven't seen the show yet. But basically, it focuses on Daredevil struggling with the fallout of something that happens. And it's a great story of sort of how Daredevil came into being, how he sort of dealt with his father, how he dealt with some of the issues of his past. What's interesting, though, is that this was written by Jeff Loeb, who is Marvel's head of television. So I'm curious to see when the show comes out in a day, how many of the elements that Jeff Loeb wrote, or Frank Miller wrote, or any of the other previous writers, what elements were taken into the show. I have a couple theories about the Battle in Jack Murdock's robe and how that comes into Daredevil's costume, but I'm not positive on that, so don't quote me. Don't hold me to that if I'm wrong. The final one I want to discuss is a very, very different one. It's called Daredevil Noir, and this is the last one I'm going to talk about, and it's interesting because this takes place in the 1930s. I think. Maybe it's the 40s. Basically, it takes place pre-World War II. Now, there's several noirs for all these different characters. I also have the Spider-Man and Punisher noir. But the twist on this is that it takes place in the 30s. It's not part of the main storyline. It's just a cool reimagining of the character. I really like things set in a historical context, regardless of what that context is. It's a really cool reimagining of the character, sort of looking at how Daredevil would work in the 1920s. I don't want to tell you too much about it because it is its own self-contained story, so it's not something that's it's obvious. Oh, everyone knows that Daredevil is this. This is its own story, its own self-contained, and it's a really, really cool book. So I don't want to spoil too much about it, but it's awesome. It's really, really cool. Granted, I am biased because I love Daredevil. As I've said before, Daredevil is my favorite hero. I got the Daredevil shirt. But yeah, so those are just some cool book ideas in case you want to look into reading some original Daredevil. So that's all I have for this video. The only other thing I want to mention is if you head over to our website, thenerdyinc.com, you'll find that we do our weekly comic book reviews. Basically, the main conceit is that if you have 15 bucks and you walk into a comic book store, what are you going to buy this week? So Derek, our chief comics correspondent, if we're going to assign titles, he does a weekly review of comics, talks about some of the best books of the week. So I highly recommend you guys check out that if you're into comic books. Anyway, that was the one final point I want to mention. Like I said, Daredevil is premiering on Netflix in a couple hours. I'm really excited for it. You will see a review next week once I have a chance to binge watch the whole thing. But that's all I have for you right now. If you've enjoyed this video, like, comment, subscribe, all that good stuff is much appreciated, and I will see you next time.